Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening at the Mark Twain Library for another installment of our Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy series, presented by the Reading League of Voters and the Mark Twain Library. I'm Maggie McIntyre, the Adult Programming Associate at the library. In a moment, I'm going to let tonight's moderator introduce our guest speakers, co-authors Marc Lamont Hill and Todd Brewster. Just one quick note, Mark had a conflict this evening, but he will be joining us a bit later in the program. Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy was created in 2019 and is sponsored by the Mark Twain Library and Reading League of Women Voters. This series of lectures and events won the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service. Just a quick thank you to area organizations for their support of this series: the public libraries of Easton, Weston, Newtown, and Ridgefield, the Friends of the Weston Public Library, and the Leagues of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, Ridgefield, and Weston. We are recording tonight's program, and you can view it next week on the library's YouTube channel. There will be a time for questions at the end of the program, and you're welcome to submit your questions at any time during the course of the program, just using the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We are also offering closed captioning, and you can also access that at the bottom of your screen as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our host for tonight's program, Dr. Daniel W. Barrett. Dr. Barrett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University and a member of the Conversations Committee. A resident of Reading, he graduated from Wesleyan University and earned a PhD in social psychology from Arizona State University. He has also served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Barrett, I'll now turn it over to you. We thank you so much for hosting tonight's conversations discussion.
Thank you, Maggie. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth, myth, and democracy. So I want to first thank the Mark Twain Library for sponsoring this event, as well as the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I am a proud board member, for also organizing and sponsoring tonight's event. Tonight, we're excited to have, at this point anyway, one, and then soon two, outstanding writers and thinkers as our conversation guests. And those who don't already know, let me introduce you first to Todd Brewster. So Todd worked as an editor for Time and Life and as a senior producer for ABC News. He's taught at Temple University, at Wesleyan University, Mount Holyoke, and was a Knight Fellow at the Yale Law School. He's a prolific author and has co-authored or authored a number of books, including the one we'll talk about tonight, which is called Seen and Unseen, Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. He's also co-written The Century with the late Peter Jennings, the news anchor for ABC News. And he was the sole author, or is the sole author, of Lincoln's Gamble, the tumultuous 6 months that gave America the Emancipation Proclamation and changed the course of the Civil War. That's a mouthful. Good title, though. And Todd is also our neighbor. He lives just west of us in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So as you know, Todd's supposed to be joined by Dr. Marc Lamont tonight. And even though Mark isn't here yet, I'm going to introduce him as if he were, so that when he does jump on a little bit later on, we don't have to stop and say, okay, here's this guy and here's all about him. So anyway, so Mark is currently the host of BET News and Black News Tonight, and is the Steve Charles Chair in Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University. He's a founder and director of the People's Education Center, and he owns a combined coffee shop and bookshop in Philadelphia, which I have not been to yet, but will when I go down next time. So I love that combination of books and coffee. Mark has co-authored and authored many books, including the one we'll talk about tonight, another book called Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, and several other things. So I have direct, or I should say indirect connections with both Todd and with Mark. So Todd, you've taught at Wesleyan, which is where I got my undergraduate degree. And then Mark got his PhD and master's at Annenberg at UPenn, which is where I did my postdoctoral fellowship. So we have some overlapping affiliations there. Probably not at the same time, but some affiliations that were similar. So again, I'm going to focus primarily tonight on your most recent book that you wrote with Mark, called Seen and Unseen, Technology, Social Media, and the Fight for Racial Justice. And to audience members who have not read it yet, I strongly recommend doing so. It's highly readable, and it's a penetrating analysis of the effects of visual media on awareness of and responses to racial justice in our society. And Todd, your work and Marc's work they're a great addition to our conversation series. And not only are long hidden truths of the existence and prevalence of racist behavior more frequently coming to the surface, but there's hope that what you call the democratization of technology will uproot some of the hierarchies of power and lead to a more democratic and just society. And so you and your work are perfect for our series, and I look forward to chatting with you tonight. So we'll start with some questions I have prepared for Todd for now, and then for Marc when he joins us later on. And then around 8:30 or so, we'll turn to audience questions. So as Maggie said, if you're in the audience and you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will address them to Marc and or Todd a little bit later on. So let's get to it. My first question stems from the first paragraph on the first page of your book. Okay. And I think your answer will provide a nice framework for tonight's conversation. So on that page, you state, indeed, this is a quotation, indeed, it would be no exaggeration to say that the storytelling of novelists, filmmakers, journalists, and academics was as crucial, perhaps even more crucial, to establishing Jim Crow and its era of cruel servitude, as was the work of segregationist lawmakers. So it's a fascinating statement. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that for us and tell the audience what you were thinking about and why you make that claim.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank you, Dan and Maggie and Elaine, for inviting me and Marc to address the audience tonight. It feels odd to be looking out into my computer and knowing there are 70 or 80 people out there that I can't see. So I hope the next time this happens, maybe we can do it in person. I love doing events like this, and even more so when I can look people in the eyes. So, but I'm very fond of Reading. I've been there many, many times, and I'm thrilled that you've invited us tonight. The book is really an exploration of the story of race in America as told through the mass media, and it begins with the story of Frederick Douglass and his obsession with photography, and goes all the way through from in the 19th century, from all the way through to the present moment, and analyzes 3 or 4 events of the past few years that have been where the story has actually been enhanced by our ability to see it through new forms of media. But your question, Dan, goes to the heart of what I think is the sort of the soul of the book, which is that, we tend to, although we're a nation of laws, not men, is often quoted, we tend to operate more commonly in the parlance of our popular culture. And our popular culture promoted racism every bit as much as our laws did. In fact, the laws were informed more by the popular culture than the popular culture was informed by the laws. And you discover that as you go back through American history and begin to look at the role of novelists, of filmmakers, of historians in propping up a racist society. And it travels all the way through the 20th century up to the present moment. I mean, it's stunning to go back, for instance, and look at one of the first great movies produced, first feature films produced, which was Birth of a Nation, and see the portrayal there of the most racist caricatures of Black people, as well as a retelling of the story of the Civil War in a way that erases the culpability of the Southern states for their secession, as well as their culpability in slavery. And that has traveled all the way through American popular culture through the 20th century, through Gone with the Wind, and on the other side too, by the way, we fought back. Those who believe in the notion of equality have fought back against these caricatures, with the civil rights movement being told more or less through photojournalism, through the work of Ida B. Wells back at the turn of into the 20th century, and right up to the present moment, when, as we mentioned, we isolate the stories of several events of the past few years where the camera, the video camera, the cell phone video camera was crucial in telling the stories that otherwise would not have been told.
Well, thank you. So I was wondering if you could actually tell us what those events are, just briefly, the 3 or 4 big events you talk about in the book. And then if you could walk us through one in more detail, sort of what happened and what was the media aftermath of those events, and what was the role of technology in that response to, reaction to that event?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of your viewers out there will recognize these events. The most prominent one, of course, is George Floyd. I mean, the story of George Floyd is a landmark in American history. It really is. I mean, it's you can say that there are multiple reasons why it galvanized the country, and multiple reasons why the world really responded to what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. Certainly, we all were home because of the pandemic. There was a frustration in the society that needed to express itself. But at the core of it was the brutal murder of a Black man on the street of Minneapolis by a white police officer, the extinguishing of his life with a knee to the neck, captured on video, not by a body camera of a police officer, although there were body cameras as well, but by a bystander, Darnella Frazier, who happened to be on the way to Cup Foods with her sister to buy some snacks, saw what was happening, pulled out her camera, and began recording it. And this is what we mean by the democratization of video. It is suddenly, whereas 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, the only people who had cameras, video cameras, and could record what they saw in front of them and publish it, those two elements together, were professionals. And beginning with Rodney King, but then moving forward from Rodney King to the present moment, when all of us carry one of these things in our pocket that is a tool for recording anything we see. And within this tool, the option to be able to post it onto social media sites where it can be seen the world over instantaneously. This has changed the public conversation about race. So when George Floyd was murdered on the streets of Minneapolis, it was recorded by Darnella Frazier, a teenage girl walking with her sister on the way to Cup Foods, published and seen the world over. That, to us, is the democratization of video. And it's the ability to be able to see things, as the title of our book says, seen and unseen, that were not seen. Were probably still happening, by the way. Almost certainly, the murder of George Floyd would have happened whether there was a camera present or not. Just as Walter Scott, who was murdered in North Charleston, South Carolina, a few years ago, when on a traffic stop, was captured on video by another bystander, a Dominican barber who was on his way to work in the morning, who saw him pull out his camera. As a result, that police officer is in jail, in prison for the rest of his life. These things happen because we have been able to give the tools of journalism to ordinary people, to all of us. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a downside to it, too. But the upside is that communities that have not been seen, people who have not been seen, people who have been claiming that this is the experience of the Black race in America, now have a document to show, one that is irrefutable. And so the stories that we isolate in Seen and Unseen are George Floyd, also Ahmaud Arbery. If you don't know this story, I'll
You're breaking up just a little bit there, Todd.
It's the story of a young. Is that? You hear me more clearly now? Are you hearing me?
Yeah. Yes, I can right now.
Okay, all right. It's suddenly said the internet connection's unstable, but I'm back. In the case of Ahmaud Arbery, he was a young man who was out jogging on a route through a white neighborhood in Southeast Georgia, and was being watched by a sort of neighborhood patrol, or more or less really sort of self-appointed neighborhood patrol of these men who had believed that he was there to steal things from a construction site that was part of the route. And they chased after him in a pickup truck, cornered him, and then jumped out and confronted him. And as they did, pulled a gun on him, and then there was an ensuing scuffle in which Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed. That story was captured amazingly on video by one of the men who actually was implicated by the crime. We also tell the story of Charlottesville, which goes back to 2017, which was the story of a rally being held there, Unite the Right rally that was being held in Charlottesville, Virginia, around the time near the campus of the University of Virginia. A very interesting story because it was a neo-Nazi rally. There were people coming from all over the country. There were concerns about whether they were coming there for violence. They were actually coming to protest the decision by the city to take down statues of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee in the town. And they marched first to the University of Virginia. On the first night they arrived there, went to the statue for Thomas Jefferson to pay homage to it. And as they did, students from the University of Virginia converged on the statue as well to protect it. And ironically, these things speak into the big symbols of history when you realize this. Both sides were trying to protect Jefferson. Jefferson, who was also a complicated figure, carried a history of slave ownership, yet also wrote the Declaration of Independence with the words, "All men are created equal." And so you have two sides of the American story here, played out in one historic founding generation figure, and a confrontation in the 21st century between two sides of the American personality. One trying to embrace Jefferson for one reason, the other one embracing Jefferson for the other reason. Eventually, there is violence in Charlottesville, and a young woman is killed. The other story we tell is the story of Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a protest over another police killing there had resulted in marching of right-wing supporters and left-wing supporters in the town of Kenosha, which resulted in violence that implicated a young teenager from Illinois who had gone there in order to police the streets. And he had opened fire on several individuals and killed two of them. So these are the stories we tell in Seen and Unseen. And the important thing is that we put them into context with the rest of American history and the story of race as it's told throughout in the form of imagery, novels, photography, photojournalism, and finally the cell phone.
Yeah, so I like the way you talked about, you mentioned Ida B. Wells earlier this evening, but also you talk about her in your book, and it's a way to look back on history and see somebody else who way ahead of her time in a sense, used media, used photographs to actually change the world in a way as well. You call her a pioneer of data journalism, in your book, for her investigation, reporting on lynching and other atrocities inflicted against African Americans in our history. So for readers who don't know much about her, could you just quickly tell us who she is and what the impact of her work was at the time?
Yeah, Ida B. Wells is an amazing person, and those who don't know her should just learn a little bit about her because she's one of those great American heroes. Ida B. Wells was a woman journalist in the late 19th century, already a pioneer in that respect. A Black woman from Memphis, whose work focused on the tradition of lynching in Reconstruction America. As you audience no doubt knows, lynching was a common tactic both for an extra legal form of justice and as a way of intimidating the Black population from trying to move out of their social station. The interesting thing about the history of lynching in America is the level of pride with which the lynchers applied their craft. And it was not uncommon to have these lynchings carried out in great public spectacles where crowds would come in order to witness it. They were reported on the newspaper with vicious language about the savage getting his just desserts, the burning of the flesh, the hanging of pictures of the hanging of men in great celebratory scenes where people are taking photographs and using them as postcards in order to send others around the country to say, I was there for this event. That level of barbarism is difficult for us to comprehend in the 21st century. But it did happen in America in the late 19th century. The genius of Ida B. Wells was to go after the story of lynching, not simply for its barbarism, but for its injustice on all levels. And one of the things that she did was to research in depth the crimes that these most often men, but occasionally women, were charged with that were being lynched around the country, and the proved that in most of the cases, the charges were either trumped up, false, made in order to hide the actions of white women who, because often these were accusations of sexual crimes or accusations of rape, and she went about proving that the charges were at best trumped up, often completely false, and built enormous sets of data about all this that were published in something she called the Red Record and other journals that she was able to work to publish with the NAACP. And Ida B. Wells' genius was that she showed that you could take these photographs that were being used to celebrate the lynching, and instead, putting them in a different context, shame the country into realizing what we were tolerating in our land. And the result was that she helped to turn the entire tide of public opinion against lynching, so that by the middle of the 1920s, 1930s, lynching was on a dramatic decline, and eventually, of course, it ceased to happen. It is important to recognize Ida B. Wells just because she was a pioneer in this work, but it also is important to see how she was able to take one notion, one image, and be able to, an image that was taken in order to celebrate an act of barbarism, and change the context of the same image and deliver a different message.
Yes, yeah, so thanks for that. I want to move on down to Frederick Douglass, who you also, I think you mentioned earlier already, but he was a man ahead of his time as well, a man of his time and ahead of his time. And I read his unabridged final autobiography a couple of years ago, and was fascinated and terrified by it at the same time. But he's such an impressive man, and he used photography for his own sake as well. So here's another case of somebody who, African American, who realized the power of photography to say things, to represent African Americans in a positive light. So could you talk about him a little bit and how he did that and why he did that?
People are stunned to learn this fact, but the most photographed man in the 19th century was not Abraham Lincoln. He was Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
And you ask, well, why? And part of it was that he was very interested in telling his own story. I mean, he was a man who wrote several autobiographies.
Yes.
But he was also interested in the technology of his time. And of course, the two really commanding communications technologies of the mid to late 19th century were the telegraph and the photograph. And it was important to him because and it was important, just as it was important later to W.B. Du Bois when he put together a very impressive exhibit for the Paris Exposition of 1900, that Black people be photographed and those photographs be published and disseminated in order to demonstrate their equality, for people to be able to see them in all their dignity. And so Frederick Douglass was very keen on taking his own image in order to represent himself, a former slave, as something more than a victim, something to be respected and looked upon for his dignity and his humanity. And so he took an extraordinary number of images of him, pictures taken of himself, in order to be able to publish, to show people that he was an equal party. He was equal to the white people that would buy these published documents. And it married up interestingly in his story with the times when he would come to speak at abolition societies, and would be standing before them speaking with great eloquence about the importance of abolition. And the questions, just like an event like tonight, when the question and answer would be all afterwards about, what was it like to be a slave? Can you show us the wounds on your ankles? Can you show us the whip marks on your back? How were you deprived? Were you allowed to have food and water? And for him, it was less interesting to talk about what it was like to be a slave than what it was like to be a free person. And to be a free person was to show himself in the dignity that a photograph allowed him to see. This was also a time when, just like in our own age, when we look upon this the cell phone camera and the social media, we say, what are the possibilities for new forms of justice that can be emerged from our ability to use these tools? To Douglass, as well as to Lincoln, by the way, who also had a fascination with photography, the photograph was an agent to democratization, and technology was as an agent to new forms of freedom. So you look back at that and you think about Frederick Douglass doing this in the late 19th century, and you say, forward the camera 125 years later, here we are in the first third of the 21st century. We're talking about the same thing, just with different tools. Mm-hmm. And it leads us to the very critical message, one of the very critical messages of our book here, which is that the tools of technology, while extraordinarily powerful, they are amoral. They don't come with a morality. They don't come with instructions on how to further justice. It is how we use those tools. We as humans use those tools that we can find ways to new freedoms and to new forms of justice and in new forms of progress.
So let me go back to another event in the 19th century, and then we take that and move forward again to the present time. So roughly a third of the way through your book, you mentioned the myth of the lost cause. And this topic has particular traction with our audience because we've had several sessions in the past, the conversation series, we've talked about justice myth. And so people know, many of our audience members know this fairly well. So for example, in January, David Zucchino was our guest, and we talked to him about his book called Wilmington's Lie. Not sure if you're familiar with that book, but it's a book about a coup that happened in Wilmington, South Carolina, in which a democratically elected government was actually forcibly kicked out, was removed by white supremacists because it had Black members in it. And these white supremacists took over the town, ended up pushing people out of town, murdered over 60 African Americans. And it's one of these events that people don't really know much about. So thinking about, again, our ideas of truth, myth, and democracy for this series, here's a truth that none of us knew about and has now come out in light and changed, certainly the local area as well as the consciousness across the country. And the violence that happened there was flamed by the media, so by the newspapers at that time. There were rumors about the Black members of the community were getting guns together because they were going to come and start killing white people and so on and so forth, which were all just rumors. They were all false. But that led to, because they were spread in the media, the fanning of the flames. And eventually whites started actually getting guns, getting weapons, preparing, took over the town, and had, as I said, committed some serious atrocities against African Americans. So that's all sort of centered around this idea of the lost cause to some extent. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, why did you talk about this in your book? So your book is mostly about contemporary times, but you do bring up the lost cause as well there. And so could you talk about the connection you saw with that, with contemporary times, and how you tie technology to that line of history?
Well, I mentioned before the movie The Birth of a Nation, which was a filmic treatment of the myth of the lost cause. History is something that is flexible and fungible, or I should say, it's treated. Histories are written by people who bring their own set of prejudices and beliefs in winners and losers to the telling of stories. So when we think about the American story of the Civil War, the how we understand that piece of American history is determined in part by who's doing the telling. And throughout American history, from the time of the Civil War going forward, the story of the Civil War itself has been told and retold with various sensibilities and sensitivities animating that story. The Birth of a Nation was over 100 years ago, and we look upon it as this racist relic. But you don't have to go very far to find the story of the myth of the lost cause in contemporary America. You don't have to go any further than your local library. I'm not speaking about the Reading Library here, I'm sure, but their library is not far from the Reading Library, who are unfortunately re-examining the story of the Civil War under pressure from those in the community who believe that they want the story told differently. I wrote a book called Lincoln's Gamble. You mentioned it before, 7 years ago, about the story of Abraham. It's 6 months in the life of Abraham Lincoln, from July 1862 to January 1863. It's from the time he first mentions that he's going to free the slaves to the point when he actually signs the Emancipation Proclamation. 6 critical months in the war, 6 critical months in Lincoln's life, time when he was not single-minded about freeing the slaves, when he went back and forth, courageous at times, cowardly at other times, to where he finally made the decision to sign the. Frederick Douglass at the last minute, and even on January 1, 1863, doesn't believe that Lincoln's going to sign it. He's still not sure until the news comes up from Washington to Boston and the people begin celebrating. I went down to Atlanta about 3 months into the media tour for that book, and I spoke to a large audience at the History Center there. And several people got up from the audience and challenged me by saying that Lincoln was the worst president in American history, basically voicing the story of the lost cause. That was 7 years ago. And in American life in the succeeding 7 years, nothing has surprised me, given what I saw that night. And
we lost you again for a moment there.
Persistence of the Civil War in American life, of the story of the Civil War in American life. All you have to do in the last few years is look at the controversy over the renaming of public squares, or the taking down of statues to Confederate war heroes. All you have to do is mention the story of the 1619 Project, or the critical race theory, to begin the story again of the American Civil War being argued out in libraries and schools, at school boards, in the popular culture, in the daily newspapers, in every website that treats public controversies. Every day there is something about this. There's both overt and subliminal messages. Open the pages of the New York Post and you'll see very prominently displayed day after day after day, crimes being committed by Black people. The specter of the Black menace, the reinforcing of the notion of the Black savage, the Black thug, the destroying the image of dignity of the Black race that Frederick Douglass himself addressed back in the 1860s, 1850s, 60s, and 70s. So these stories continue to animate our popular history. And they continue to be part of our public conversation. So when we go back and talk about Ida B. Wells, we talk about Frederick Douglass, we talk about the photojournalism of the 1960s that helped to build to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Talking about Selma, what we think about Selma, we think about those images. When we look at Derek Chauvin with his knee in the neck of George Floyd, the knee in the neck was an image. Civil rights movement, Birmingham, rioting, 1963. Very famous photograph of a white police officer pinning a Black woman to the streets. This is the rioting that happened after the church bombing in 1963 at Birmingham, when he's pinning her down with his knee.
Yeah.
And very, very famously, Lorraine Hansberry, the author of A Raisin of the Sun, called by Attorney General Robert Kennedy to a meeting to discuss what could be done. What is it that Black people want? What is it the Negro wants? Which was the question in 1963. And how are we going to keep the Negro quiet was the idea. And one of the first things she said to him was, well, I think you have to do something about living in a society that tolerates a photograph like I saw with a knee in the neck of a Black woman on the streets of Birmingham, Alabama. These symbolic, what did the Black Power movement of the 1960s shout? We want, what does the Negro want? We want the white man's knee off our neck. And here we have, in 2020, a white police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black man until he extinguishes his life.
Mm-hmm. Another instance of the prevalence of this myth in today's society has to do with the naming of some of our military bases. And so we had a historian on this series last year, Ty Sedgley, who wrote
I know Ty Sedgley.
You know Ty? Yeah, so he was here,
very well.
Charles Dew, another historian,
Yeah.
and talked a lot about these same kinds of ideas and concerns and problems in American history. And so we discussed with Ty his book, Robert E. Lee and Me, and he talks about how when he was at West Point, he was just shocked by how many monuments and rooms and whatever were named after Robert E. Lee, who was this, he was a traitor. Yet West Point was celebrating his status in some extraordinary way. And so it turns out that Ty, as you probably know, then was on this presidential commission looking at renaming of various military bases across the country. And there was a fight about that, obviously, as well, for the reasons you've already been talking about. So it's fun to have Ty on the session.
Well, absolutely. Ty's one of the great academics in the Army, and I was the originator of the Center for Oral History at West Point, so we worked very closely together for a number of years. Yeah, yeah, and he's doing great work with exposing that, I believe. Yes. Yeah,
he really is. So on page 39, you have another quotation I want to just read to you, and you write, "Why hasn't the spectacle of death And here you're referring to recent murders of Black people by civilians and or the police. So why has the spectacle of death forced us into a state of permanent outrage and vigilance? So how would you, or how do you now answer that question? So this question you posed, you and Mark posed, how would you answer that question? Why hasn't that happened?
Yeah, well, I think that it's somewhat rhetorical to begin with.
I recognize that. Yeah.
But I would argue that what we're trying to bring attention to there is what made George Floyd, for instance, different than the many other police and vigilante violent killings of the past few years. And the difference was in, quote unquote, the storytelling, right? It is what I referenced before, that it was the knee on the neck. It was the fact that George Floyd's killing was both a moving image, by that I mean traveling, and it was sculptural. It was a still photograph in a sense, because it never changed. It was one assemblage of a white police officer, a man of authority, with his knee on the neck of a Black man pinned to the ground. And it stayed that way for 9 minutes, for over 9 minutes. Therefore, it was easier to apprehend as an image than some of the other stories that are told through actual events that happened. The story of Eric Garner, or the story of Ahmaud Arbery, for that matter. These stories are told differently. And so it's in the storytelling in part that we find that we as a people react. And this was the brilliance, as I mentioned before, of Ida B. Wells, is that she was essentially saying, if you reframe these same images, you will see the horror that you're witnessing. And when you frame an image of the killing of a Black man by a white police officer, you see, if you see it differently, the story is told differently, more compellingly, it is more effective. It creates more outrage. And the outrage from George Floyd's murder was commanding. It did galvanize the country. There are murals that have been painted across the world from everybody across the world knows the name George Floyd. There are sculptures built. It's a different kind of image too. When you think about it, we're talking about the statues that remain up, some of them, many of them, and Ty Sedgley spoke to the role that these Confederate traitors still are being honored at places, in the military bases, and including West Point, which leaned towards the South, by the way, of the Civil War. So it's not surprising in some respects, but it's surprising that it lasted this long. And I think that the reason that we respond to these things, it's in the telling. And the outrage comes only when we tell the stories and tell them well.
So I want to ask you about the work of Neil Postman.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you know who Neil is. He was
I know him very, very well. I've read all of his material, yeah.
Yeah, so he wrote a fabulous book called Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah.
It's about entertainment and amusement in America. And for those who don't know this highly original work, Postman describes a nation in which the TV is our way of viewing the world. So this was 1985, by the way, way before the cell phone. But he talked about how once we were so glued to the television set that everything in the world looked to us like we would see it. We were seeing it through a television set. We expect it to be that way. So we're looking for entertainment in every aspect of our lives. We look for it in history, in politics. The news had to be entertaining. If it wasn't entertainment, if it wasn't like TV, it wasn't worth watching. That was Postman's premise and his argument, I think quite compellingly so. He also talks about the Lincoln Douglas debates, which you mentioned in your book on Lincoln, and how they lasted several hours, and folks would have to sit there and listen to him, each one speak for an hour and a half straight with no interruptions. And they had the attention span to do that, or to read their dialogues in a newspaper, which were obviously quite lengthy. So, Postman, again, wrote this in 1985, he passed away in 2003, I believe, which is before we actually had the first iPhone. So he
Yeah.
missed this whole change in digital
Yeah.
media in the last 20 or so years. So I'm thinking, in a sense, we could see the work that you've done with Mark as being an extension of Postman's argument about television. Now it would be the cell phone rather than television, but playing the same kind of role, perhaps even more powerful, because a cell phone, unlike TV, it was mobile. It
Yeah.
wasn't just a viewing device, it's also a recording device.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm flattered you mentioned our names in the same expression as Neil Postman, who is one of the great thinkers, I think, of the past 50 to 70 years. I'm very familiar with Postman's work. This is a small plug because it's also a Reading event. Maggie McIntyre just signed me on to come back on to the Reading Library in June to talk about my next book, which is coming out at the end of May, which is called American Childhood, a photographic history, and it's taps into a lot of Postman's thinking, which he also wrote the book called The Disappearance of the Child, or Disappearance of Childhood. I'm not sure which it was.
Childhood.
Yes, is the answer to your. Linking the ideas of Postman to what we've done here. I do believe that Postman was certainly onto something, and yes, we've all had the experience of going to a concert or a lecture or something, and people holding up their cell phones in order to record what they're watching, and they're more interested in recording it than they are in watching it. Sometimes seems because somehow recording it makes it real. I'm not sure. I always wonder how many of those cell phone videos of a concert or whatever are then actually shared with anyone. I think they're just. It's just, as you say, this idea that if we don't record it with our technology, then did it happen, right? Were we there? And will be familiar to all your audience, I'm sure, this sense of anxiety if we don't have our device near us, that it somehow is an extension of us. And in some ways, as we're learning with the arrival of AI and our ability to understand that we're increasingly becoming one with these machines. I'll add a couple of things to this, and I don't know whether we outlined it in Seen and Unseen, but I know I've written about it in other places. Technology is an interesting thing, because particularly communications technology, because it seems like every time a new communications technology arrives, there's a great deal of flurry around it, while we remain confused about how we're going to use it in our lives. We don't understand the vocabulary of it. We don't understand how to put sentences together with it. I don't mean literally sentence, but what kind of vocabulary we're going to use in order to construct a communication through the tools that we have now, or that are new. It happened with the radio. I'm sure it happened with print. You go back to the founding era, the role of the printing press was particularly important. But it happens with television. It happened with the arrival of cable television. It happened to arrive with the arrival of the internet, with social media, with the cell phone or the smartphone. It's going to happen with AI. Increasingly, we are seeing the pace of technology become more rapid, though. And whereas we had, or it was 25, 30 years of radio alone before television emerged, and then another 20 to 25 years after television before cable television arrived, and then after that it became shorter, and then to the internet, and then shorter to the social media, and then shorter to the smartphone. And each time we have less time to acquaint ourselves with the technology and to use it in useful, constructive ways. Getting back to the themes of the book, I do believe that what the cell phone has done and social media and the cell phone video have done is that they have allowed, as our book title says, seen and unseen populations to be seen in a different way, for communities to be created and shared across a vast pieces of real estate that otherwise would never have connected them. There are positive things to come from what we've, but there are also dangers. And Postman was particularly onto them. And it's important that people like Postman help keep us honest with what we're doing.
Mhm. So I'm glad you know his work, and look forward to seeing your book as well then in June. Something else. So in Unseen, you talk about the Statue of Liberty. You have a few pages there, and you describe what she originally was supposed to look like, supposed to be wearing the chains, where the chains were on her body, and what her symbolism means today to all of us in this country. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was even some thought that the original model for the Statue of Liberty was to be a Black woman. There's a people. The reason we isolated the Statue of Liberty was because of the role that people took upon looking upon it, an image of significance and owning it for themselves. I'm going to shift off of that for a second to come back to it, and that is to discuss James Baldwin, who figures very prominently in this book. James Baldwin was one of the great American writers, a Black man who was a terrific novelist and essayist, whose work is worth your audience. I'm sure your audience is familiar with it. But what's interesting about James Baldwin and the cell phone and social media is that he has become something of an influencer, to use the term, in the 21st century. His one-liners, which were particularly poetic and evocative, have emerged on social media repeatedly as some of these stories played out over the past few years. And what is also interesting is that as these passages from Baldwin are shared, they often get altered. It's a little like the game of post office, where you have a statement that you pass on, and it changes just by virtue of one person telling it to another person, and then that person telling it to yet another person.
Telephone game.
And that happens. Telephone. I'm sorry. Did I say post off? I meant telephone. And the amazing thing is that at first, purists may say, maybe even Bald himself would have said, wow, my words are being twisted, right? I actually think Baldwin might have said something differently. I think he may have found it particularly intriguing and been amused, as well as inspired by seeing people take something that was his original creation and adding themselves to it, doing something with it, changing the words, molding them, informing them with things that are happening in the world that they live in. And the same thing happened with Statue of Liberty. That's why we use that image, is to be able to show that things that were created for one purpose can be repurposed and changed. And the Statue of Liberty appears in great quantity, both as in social media, both as a symbol of freedom and as some cases the mocking of American delivery on freedom. But it's a popular culture image that has taken on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. So you mentioned we're at an inflection point in American history in terms of democracy, the media, racial injustice, and so forth. And I think you correctly said that there is a change in how we use these technologies just in recent years, and we've seen light cast upon injustices which formerly were unseen, just to go with the theme of your book, the title of your book. So I'm wondering, you mentioned a few minutes ago that there are disadvantages to this as well. So really both sides have the technology available to them. So as much as we see these injustices being shown on TV and people are rising up saying, stop this, change your behavior, whatever, we get rid of state condoned violence against African Americans and other people of color. You also have the white supremacists and the far right reactionaries having access to the same technologies and pushing back as strongly, maybe even more strongly than what to be pushed against. So I'm wondering, you sound optimistic in your book, and it's wonderful to hear your optimism. But could you talk more about why you think the strengths do outweigh the weaknesses, maybe why, how it is that we can turn this around so that we see more of the stuff that we need to see to understand the truth of our history, and able to sort of push aside or push away some of the other stuff that's going on out there.
Yeah, I'd say I'm genuinely optimistic about life. So I'm optimistic about how our ability to use these technologies in a constructive way. The chapter in the book that deals most directly with the telling of stories and how it can change your understanding of them is the chapter about Kenosha, because if you go onto YouTube, there is an enormous quantity of video about what happened in Kenosha, shot from multiple perspectives and then edited and produced and telling the same story one way and then telling it another way based upon the perception of the person. This is a persistent question in all journalism today. I teach journalism. It's a tough nut to crack because the fact of the matter is there is perspective, and it's the perspective of the storyteller. Once you raise a camera up, you're already framing. And when you're framing, you're choosing to frame some things and not others. And in doing so, you are making an editorial decision. When you produce a video, take what you've shot and turn it into something that is a piece of storytelling, you are doing something, again, with perspective. There's making an editorial judgment. How do you make that editorial judgment? Do you make it while being consistent to the facts? And do you make it in the spirit of values that are to be embraced versus values that are to be condemned? And your audience may say, well, how do we make that judgment? Aren't we automatically being biased? Well, as a society, we do embrace certain values. Community, we're embracing tonight. Equality, we're embracing tonight. That's the spirit of what we're talking about. Morality, we're embracing tonight. We are embracing progress tonight. Things that are not progressive, that are not community enhancing, that are not equality affirming, are things that in our national judgment we condemn. And in that spirit, every storyteller embraces some consistent point of view. If we take that as a given, then we would want to go to storytellers who tell stories in the spirit of those values, not using lies, not using falsehoods, not trying to manipulate, not altering facts, but nonetheless offering a perspective which includes, by the way, the totality of the truth involved. I mean, one of the things that I always teach my journalism students is go to Chicago and stand in front of one of those great public sculptures they have there on public squares, the Picasso or the Dubuffet or these things, and go look at it from one perspective, then walk a quarter of the way around the sculpture and look at it from a different perspective. Suddenly it's a completely different thing you're looking at. That's true of a story. It's true of a story that you tell from one person's perspective versus another one's. It's true of a story you tell when you arrive on the scene at one moment or whether you arrive 5 minutes later. It's true of a story that's told with a frame that's this way instead of that way. So it is a given that we want to learn as much as we can in order to understand a story in its multiple perspectives. But do we bring these certain agreed upon public values to what we do? And do we bring a respect for honesty and factual representation? If we do, then I think we are telling a story in a way that is constructive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recall the story of Louis Mink once. So the history was really, it is a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And every history book that we write, every history we can envision is always going to be a story at its heart. And we have to start somewhere. We have to end it somewhere. And where we start and end it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
in terms of what story we end up telling. You might cut it
Yeah.
off at
And
a
that's,
certain point because you want history to seemingly, if it ended at a certain point, that tells a story the way you want it to, because it shows that what you want it to show rather than what the truth may have been at the time.
mhm. And we as humans, we respond to stories, right? And we traditionally in Western culture respond to stories told in a certain way that involve exposition and then development and conflict and then resolution. That's sort of the way we think, but that's changing as new cultural infusions come from other parts of the world into our methods of storytelling, and um, we will be enhanced by that. So it's part of the way we apprehend life.
Mhm. Yeah, so I want to ask you about what's happening in Florida and other states right now with regards to history. So, as you know, there have been efforts to suppress history, to start telling a whole new version of history that essentially wipes out the horrors of slavery, and really candy coats much of the history of the United States. And you've seen efforts to stop the teaching of DEI material, even in hiring, job announcements. DeSantis wants to remove all those things from happening. They want to remove the term systematic racism from the curriculum. They might even prosecute, if the law that's proposed passes, it's possible they could prosecute a professor in Florida in one of the state schools for using your book in a class, because your book talks about the very things that they don't want to talk about down there. So I'm just wondering, this is, to me, and I'm sure to you too, is very, very scary stuff. And how should we respond to this and try to make sure these things don't happen? The censorship, this reversioning of history is kind of stopped in its tracks.
Yeah. I think we respond with outrage. I really do. I'm horrified by it, and I think people on the right and the left, the constructive right and the constructive left, should respond with similar outrage. I mean, this is an assault on intellectual freedom. It's not unprecedented. Those in your audience who are familiar with the story of the Scopes trial from 1925 will see we'll find echoes in what's happening in Florida. Very famously, William Jennings Bryan, who argued for the state of Tennessee in that trial, penned the line that the hand that writes the check should rule the school. And that attitude persists in school boards, not only in the state of Florida, and not only those being encouraged onto this path by Ron DeSantis, but throughout the country. I've often thought that there would be something particularly meaty for a documentary filmmaker to be focusing on the school boards of the country, and how the playing out of the very basic human and American themes make their way into the public conversation at school boards. We'd probably be surprised by the number of unconstitutional things that are being done in parts of America under the name of education. So yeah, I think it's outrageous, and I think that we'll find that I hope we'll find that we regret allowing this to take hold in Florida and other states.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let me turn to a couple of the audience questions then. So here's one. So this is obviously for you. As a broadcast journalist, how would you suggest concerned citizens respond if we notice overt or subtle images that promote racial injustice? And then an and/or, are you concerned, as iPhone technology evolves, that a similar problem might arise where the videos can be manipulated to tell a different story?
Yeah, this is very concerning, that the manipulating of videos, to represent real people saying things that they're not saying. It's a very dangerous thing for our public conversation. I think that social media will give us an option to respond to that. It will be interesting to see. For the longest time, the understanding has been, and right through George Floyd, by the way, that a picture is truthful in a way that a text may not be. A text description of something is inherently subjective, is the belief, and that a camera is somehow unvarnished truth. Now we're coming to believe that the camera doesn't represent unvarnished truth. In fact, it may be very varnished and colored and cropped and manipulated, and it will rob us in the end of one of the great tools of understanding our world if we come to not believe that a photographic representation is that a representation of what is happening and not the map's sinister intentions. I don't have the answer for how to respond to this. I think we need to know. I think our connection. Oh, there we go. I think we need to know this is happening. I think we should be prepared for the fact that there will be, just as there have been people in the past 10 years or so that have found themselves victim to conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact. We will find people who are victim to the manipulation of video and still imagery, believing things that are not truthful going forward. I think we need a kind of, I talk in the book about an inflection point. I think we are at an inflection point as to how we're going to deal with our communications media that could be inherently suspect. And it raises the question about whether what we talk about in this book, that we're now seeing things that have not been seen, whether we're at maybe some narrow window of opportunity in which that happens, and that will be taken away when in 5 years we may find that people believe that video footage of someone like George Floyd being killed is inherently false, right, manipulated, created out of whole cloth in order to try to manipulate you as a viewer.
Mm-hmm.
We need a kind of national reckoning over those, over that, right?
We do, and we need some kind of regulation if that's possible. But I'm not even sure if that's possible to do. It's such a complex issue that how would you actually go about regulating the promotion, the use of photography, of authenticity, and I don't even know where you begin to be able to do
right,
that.
because you can't, because it's of the First Amendment, which is, right, a wonderful achievement of human liberty. So it's you don't want. I mean, I think a lot of constitutional scholars are wondering whether we'll reach the point where some of the things that we embraced as aspects of a liberal culture, small L liberal, can function in the same healthy way in the 21st century as they did in previous years. But no, you can't regulate it because of the First Amendment, and we wouldn't want it to be regulated because of the First Amendment.
So you mentioned earlier that technology is amoral. And I want to maybe just twist that a little bit and suggest that technology seems to be amoral. It depends on what technology we're talking about. So, for example, algorithms, in search engines are not amoral. They're actually designed to produce certain kinds of results. They're catered to what your personal history is in terms of browsing and purchasing and those kind of things. So what seems like it's a neutral thing, as you would know, is not neutral. One of our audience members raised the idea of the issue of facial recognition software, which is racially biased as well. So here again is this technology that actually seems like it's a neutral thing. We'll actually know it's not. It can detect certain kinds of faces better than others. That makes certain kinds of mistakes more likely than other mistakes based upon a person's skin color, facial structure, and so on. You can even look at these chat programs now, the Chat GPT. The early versions of this thing were actually also quite racist in the things that they would spit out in conversations. That's being worked on now, but even so, these things are not
Yeah.
These examples are not necessarily amoral technology or technological developments.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Mark. How you doing? Glad
Mark,
you
Hey,
could.
everyone.
And we're thrilled to have him here. Mark, we're talking about Dan is talking about I spoke about technology being amoral, and he's pushing back on that a little bit by saying that it's not neutral. And actually repeat what you just said, Dan, because I think it's a very interesting point, and maybe Mark can respond to that.
Yeah.
Sure. Just quickly. So there are technologies that seem to be neutral, politically or otherwise, but actually are not. So you think about facial recognition software and how there's some racial biases built into that right now in terms of who it can be recognized accurately and who's not recognized accurately based upon skin color, facial structure, those kinds of things. Look at some of the chat programs, so that's like the Chat GPT. You know, at least early on, people would talk to this thing and it would spit out racist dogma and have all these implicit assumptions built into it that were produced by mostly the white people who developed these programs. But these kind of things that seem like they may be neutral to an ordinary observer really aren't neutral. They're actually quite moralistic, and quite harmful in some ways because of the people who are behind the creation of those technologies.
That's an interesting point, and it's a compelling argument you make. I disagree, though, but how would I push back against that? So I think part of what we're saying is that a piece of technology does not have an inherent moral or ethical value attached to it. That isn't to say, I don't think that's necessarily competing with your point, which is that there are many pieces of technology, just like there are many laws that on their face may seem neutral, but have baked into them particular biases, yes, agendas, et cetera. Well, we're not saying that technology cannot be, in the example you're giving, the technology is being put to a very particular use. But let's go philosophy class and push your example even further, right? Mm-hmm. Even in the hypothetical that you offer, a piece of technology that is more inclined to recognize one race for another could still be used in a context that could be beneficial to Black people, right? So if facial recognition software is less likely to recognize Black people, or in your case, it was more likely to recognize Black people, right?
No, it's less able to recognize the differences among Black people. So it can recognize, it's built upon looking at white faces, white skin, and facial structures, and can recognize and figure out who's who there better than it can for Black faces.
Precisely. So in the case of law enforcement, that would be a very challenging obstacle, right? The reason why that is because white people have been the template for the technology. Exactly. And the use to which it is put, though, is what makes it problematic. It's problematic because it's being used in ways that will lead to Black people being wrongly accused of things or wrongly recognized by the software. So, but again, the technological flaw doesn't have a political agenda, nor does it have a moral piece to it as such. But because it's being used by law enforcement for a purpose, which is in and of itself problematic, that's where it gets used. So it can almost becomes like an sort of abstract academic distinction we're making here, rather than as a practical matter. I don't think we're necessarily saying anything super different, because I don't think Todd or I would disagree that anything that is created by a person has baked into it a person's agenda, a person's values, a person's worldview and perspective. But I think the reason why we were making that point, and the reason why we make that argument, is more to say technology can't save us, right? So it kind of takes us back to the same place you would go, yes, right? Is that, you know, technology doesn't save us. You don't just build your way and invent your way into greater, thicker democracies. You have to be intentional about the ways that you use those technologies. You have to be critical about how they're being consumed and produced, and monetized, et cetera. And all of those things, I think, are in line with the point you're making, right? Which is that we can't divorce technology from history. We can't divorce technology from science. We can't divorce technology from the human hands that make them. I think we're all in agreement on that.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Mark, I wonder if you might actually add in, because I want you to talk, but since you haven't had to get here late, Tyree Nichols, and because he ties very much into that theme you just articulated about
That's a great point. I mean, when you think about Tyre, I mean, one of the arguments that came out of the struggles of the early part of this young century, post Trayvon Martin and certainly post Mike Brown, there's been a call for police reform, and one of the reforms that's been demanded really has been body cameras. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that the body camera would be a way of holding police accountable. If we could just watch them, if we could just see what they were doing, if they just knew that they were being watched in the kind of Foucauldian way, they would discipline themselves. They would shape their own behavior based on the observation of the few by the many, right? This idea of surveillance or respect, of surveillance. Yeah, the observation of the few by the many. So, or the many by the few, really. And so we fought for body cameras. Some of us, I didn't, but many of us fought for body cameras. And what we've seen is that the body camera, again, a piece of technology that was seen as neutral. It's whoever is under the purview of the camera will be held accountable. If it shows a young citizen running up the street with a gun attacking a cop and then they get shot, then it'll exculpate the cop. The cop will be shown to be telling the truth. If it shows a cop shooting first an unarmed Black woman, then it's dangerous to the cops. So in either way, because it holds the cops accountable. So in either way, it's a neutral piece of technology that will just tell the truth. What that ignores is the narrator. What that ignores is the power dynamic. What that ignores is the perspective, both the political perspective, but also the literal point of view and perspective of the camera. And one of the things we saw with Tyre Nichols was, this Black guy is killed by 5 Black men, police officers. And when you listen to the audio, when you watch the video, you hear them saying, stop resisting, he's reaching for my gun. You hear them narrate the video in a way that
show us your hand. Show us your hands over the.
Show us your hand. That's it.
Right.
That's it. Show us your hand.
We can all see the hands, but yes, yeah.
Exactly. It's only when we see the surveillance video from the adjacent pole that we see that this man is being beaten within an inch of his life and he's not a threat to anyone. But from the way the police narrate it, we would think something very different is happening. And because we all approach a text, whether it's a book, whether it's a video, whether it's a song, we approach it with our own understandings of the world. We bring into the interaction our trust of police. We bring into the interaction the expectation that if they say it, it's probably true, and if it's on video, it's real. So when we hear "show us your hands" and he's resisting, and and it sounds like he's reaching for a gun and all this stuff, and you assume that that's what's actually happening. But when you actually watch the video devoid of that dishonest narration, you realize something very different is happening. So again, the police have learned clearly through word of mouth, through informal forms of training, and through good old-fashioned naked raw self-preservation, to lie on the tape to make this piece of technology that was supposed to be neutral and just a truth teller actually skew in their favor, even when the facts aren't in their favor. And so again, like, the technology isn't the problem. It's not that body cameras are built to protect lying cops, and it's not like body cameras are meant to save innocent citizens. Body cameras are just body cameras. And we have to be thoughtful about sort of how they're used and not assign to them magical value, or, to your point, my friend, any kind of apolitical or decontextualized kind of power or significance.
Yeah, so, and the same thing can be said for people videotaping so-called confessions. I don't want to go running out of time, so I want to go off in another tangent, but a confession videotape, you say, okay, I can see him. I can see this guy saying he did this, therefore he did it because the camera says he did. But you don't see what's behind the camera. You don't know what was happening when they turned it off and talked to the guy in between. So even that's an example of the technology seems like it's going to be giving us the truth, but in fact, it's going to be just furthering a lie about what actually happened, what the facts may be. So let me go to another question of one of our audience members. I'm just going to read through the entire thing for you. She said, I remember seeing video of the police beating Rodney King in 1991. I thought that video provided incontrovertible proof that the police had acted illegally and horribly, and that they would be suitably charged and punished. I was incredulous when that did not happen. That was more than 30 years ago, and it seems like all that's changed is we see more and more of this kind of video. So her question then is, why has this exposure not resulted in things getting better?
I know Todd has some thoughts on this too, but I'll say this. I would not begin from the premise that things haven't gotten better. Derek Chauvin is in prison. I would be stunned if someone wasn't convicted from the killing of Tyree Nichols, if not all of them. Botham Jean, the man who had the audacity to walk into his own house, or to be sitting in his own couch, when a police officer walks in. Amy Cooper in Central Park. I mean, I think if we're using prosecutions as the measure, and I'm not saying we should, but just based on the question, if we're using prosecutions as the measure of progress, I think we have come a long way. But I think the questioner is correct in saying that videotape has not proven to be Teflon. It hasn't proven, that's the wrong metaphor. Videotapes haven't proven to be incontrovertible evidence. And I think the reason is because, again, there's something called a mode of address in film study. In film study, we talk about mode of address. Who does this film think you are? Who does this text think you are? And when you're watching Rodney King, there's an assumption. The assumption is that the average American person will see a brutal beating and say, well, this film presumes you're an average American person who sees a brutal beating. And of course, if you see a brutal beating, this is awful. Yeah, sure. But that's not what happens in the courtroom, right? So now you got 12 people in the courtroom who are not asked to appeal to kind of the emotional appeal. Instead, they're being asked to invoke what Oliver Wendell Holmes called the reasonable man standard, right? What would a reasonable person do under these circumstances? And the mode of address is not just the reasonable man or the average human or the average American. It's also the average, historically in the law, it's been the average white person. And when you look at jury pools, you see that. Mm-hmm. And so then the question becomes, well, what would the average white person do if they saw Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown or Rodney King or Walter Scott? What would they do if they saw this person walking down the street? And if the answer is, well, I'd be scared of him too. I thought he could walk through bullets too, Mike Brown. I thought that a hoodie and an Arizona iced tea signified criminality, Trayvon Martin. I thought, he could get if we hadn't beaten him with nightsticks, all of us, that he would have gotten up, beaten us up, and run through and raped and pillaged L.A. Rodney King. If you believe those kind of fantastic, violent, racist narratives about Black people, and it's not just white people who have these myths about Black people have these myths about Black people. Right? Jesse Jackson said, I'm embarrassed to say that night when I'm walking down the street and hear footsteps behind me, I'm relieved to see there's a group of white people. This is Jesse Jackson saying this, right? So if we all have these fears and these anxieties around race and around Black people in particular, then when I go into the courtroom and I'm asked to say, what would a reasonable person do as George Zimmerman or Darren Wilson or Derek Chauvin, et cetera? If my answer is, well, shit, I'd be scared too, I probably would shoot my gun. Then by the legal standard, the person is not guilty because the law has codified irrational white supremacist fears about Black people. And so that's often what happens. And so when a Black person watches this and we go, damn, that's wrong. And a white person says, yeah, that's wrong too. But then you subject it to some more scrutiny and you put them in that jury box and they go, yeah, I get it. But, at 2 a.m, that Black kid in that hoodie, yeah, I might have been afraid too. I might have pulled my weapon too. And once that happens, it's easy. So part of what we have to do is analyze, to your point, the way that race is baked into the systems themselves and the technologies, in this case, the legal technologies themselves, that lead us to these outcomes and these conclusions and normalize them.
I'll add one other thing into that, which is to the person, the viewer's question, which is that the ubiquity of the camera now is the difference between Rodney King and now. And I think going off of Mark's point, with Rodney King, there was this sense that it was an anomaly. Oh, it only doesn't happen that often. It must have been reasons for this. The
Right.
police don't do this kind of thing. It can't have happened. Look, they must have been pushed to the pressure point. It's just, this is, we can't just, there are going to be errors made once in a while. We just got to, tolerate that. It's part of the system. But in fact, what the cell phone camera has done, it has shown the ubiquity of this. It has given us evidence of how normalized, as you use Mark's word, normalized this kind of violence is from people in authority, places of authority, and therefore that it was not an anomaly, it was general fare. And if it's general fare, then it's a totally different understanding of it. And I sure, we wish that there were more outrage. This question came up earlier, Mark, about whether, why is there not, we posed the question in the book, why is there not more outrage, right? But there, I think the perspective is different than it was in 1992.
Yeah, agreed.
So one of the things that, just to go back, Postman for a second, talks about attention spans, which I mentioned earlier in the conversation. And now that we have shorter and shorter attention spans, we find the same thing in the classroom, right? Where students don't pay attention for more than maybe 10 minutes, sometimes even less than that. You need to make sure you do stuff to keep people entertained in a classroom these days. I'm sure Mark and Todd have been experiencing the same thing that I'm experiencing in that regard. So with attention spans being so short now, and with the events happening so quickly, you talked about Moore's law, things happen faster and faster and faster in technology, and they happen in the real world in the same way. And Todd, you mentioned earlier that these images flash by us so fast. I worry about some unintended consequences of that they're just so fast and fleeting that we get inured almost of them. We're so used to seeing these things, and all of a sudden they stop registering in ways they really should be registering. So we stop noticing them because they're happening so fast and so often. We stop looking at them, which is a danger of the democratization of technology in a way.
Mark, I'll let you go to that one.
Go ahead if you want to respond.
Yeah, it's certainly a concern of mine. I've had this concern particularly over the last 5 years, but certainly over the last 7, or 9 years, when we think about Ferguson's summer. But I also think about it in terms of the global kind of violence we see in places like Ukraine, when we see what's happening, in Iran. We see large amounts of violence. We see spectacles of violence, or as we talk about in the book, the spectacle of death. Mm-hmm. And there's something about the technology that allows us to see that technology, see that spectacle, to consume that spectacle, to transmit that spectacle, that is incredibly helpful and powerful and as a galvanizing force. But as you said, it's ephemeral in lots of ways. And because it's fleeting, because it's passing, and also because there's a nonstop string of these kinds of texts. I think it does a couple of things. I think you're right. I think we become inured to it. It normalizes death. It normalizes violence. It normalizes harm. These spectacles become ordinary. But it's also, the philosopher Judith Butler talks about this idea of livable lives and also grievability. And the question becomes, whose lives are grievable? Whose lives are seen as livable? Whose lives are worthy of good living? And it's because these spectacles of violence don't happen, like, it's not like 13% of the spectacles are Black people, 52 or this, it's not proportionate to the population. So when we see brown death, Black death, Jewish death, trans death, queer death, when we see marginalized, vulnerable populations harmed in these spectacles, it can also, through the text themselves, sort of objectify our lives and our bodies. Even in the academy, universities, they don't say Black people, they say Black bodies, right? There's a way that suddenly we become objectified. So not only is it just like, oh yeah, that's death. Oh yeah, oh yeah, a bomb went off in Lebanon, that's what they do there. Oh, there's famine in Africa, yeah, that's what they do there, right? There's that. But there's also a way that it has a material impact, I think, or I'm concerned, that has a material impact on how people around the world see us, or their inability to see us in terms of our humanity. So not only do you not get outraged when there's a shooting in Chicago, but you almost start to expect shootings in Chicago, which then makes when it's time to do public policy or educate or organize in Chicago, you're like you're less enthused or less willing to do so because you've become persuaded maybe at a deeper level that maybe they don't deserve anything different. And that's a dehumanizing piece of it. So the technology and the time space compression that allows things to move faster and quicker and across different spaces, it's all great for transmission, but I'm not convinced that there's not a super detriment to it on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Todd, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Mark hit it on all cylinders on that one. It's a fine balance to try to find, because you want to. I mean, the benefits of showing are real, and yet the effect over time could be to make us even less vigilant about it.
Yeah.
So we usually end these at about 9. I'm going to go. I've pushed to go about 10 more minutes, and I'll have to end it at the library. So you can have 10 more minutes since things are going quite swimmingly now. Another question from an audience member. Are we seeing more racially motivated hate crimes committed by police, but in reality, the focus on these takes the attention away from those increasing situations that are becoming endemic? Trying to say that again. So I'm not quite sure what she's asking there. We'll feel better if one officer gets put away than even if it doesn't actually change the underlying problem. It's what she's getting at here. So
yeah,
do we actually miss the forest for the trees? What she's saying here at times.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, as Todd said, there's a real danger in whenever you spotlight a case, there's a danger in making the case the whole issue, as opposed to a symptom of a broader issue.
Right.
We're not tinkering toward utopia here, right? As David Tyack would say, we're not. It's not like if we can just catch Rodney King's killer or attacker, excuse me, and catch, Mike Brown's killer and incarcerate Breonna Taylor's killer, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we're just one step closer to fixing the problem. The underlying problem that she says is cultural, and it is cultural on some level. I think it's also economic. I think it's social, to the extent that it's racial, and sexist, and all the other things. Those underlying problems don't get resolved when we focus too much on one case, unless we're committed to, particularly when it comes to police violence, right? When we would show, and we talk about this in the book, when we show pictures from the war, when we show pictures from a college campus where an awful thing has happened, there's a way that we see this as a big picture problem. But sometimes when it comes to policing, because we have a good faith belief that because we believe in policing in this country, because we believe in the criminal legal system in general in this country, we treat each act of police violence as a bad apple, as opposed to a bad orchard. And until we recognize that the problem might be the orchard, and that isn't to say that every police officer is bad, but to say that the system produces certain kinds of interactions and certain types of realities, then yes, these spectacles of violence, even when they're resolved in the way that we want, even when we get the justice that we want, we're still, I mean, imagine if we locked up and successfully prosecuted every cop who killed us, right? We would still have lots of dead Black people and lots of imprisoned cops. That's not the outcome we want, right?
I think well, I have something here. Go ahead, finish, Mark.
No, go ahead. Please.
No, it's just. I think this, the story of Tyree Nichols contributed something here that, because the first reaction, of course, and sadly, even from the police chief there in Memphis, was that, race wasn't a factor here, right? Remember this, right. And of course, the real message is that race is very much a factor. So much of a factor and so baked in that it doesn't matter what the race of the police officer is. It is built into the conduct of the police. and that's the message that comes through there. So yes, when you look at my story, Michael Brown, it was that, there are a few bad cops out there, and that is a all too common response to these incidents of violence, is that, we got to get these bad actors out, right?
Right.
And the truth of the matter is that is even less than a Band-Aid. It's at best a weak gesture, right? And the systemic issue is the one that we need to. And it comes back to, Mark, what you've talked about this. We both have talked about this, about the notion that it's the notion of punishment rather than repair, right?
Yep, that's right.
So let me go to my last question then. And as regular viewers know, I'm a fan of the Ezra Klein show, and his question, which I've stolen, his last question of his guest is always, name 3 books you recommend our listeners read to understand better the issues that you're talking about. So rather than asking for 3 each, can you each give me 1 book you might recommend to our listeners to help them understand these issues of racial injustice and violence and police brutality and technology and democracy, all this mess of issues, Freudian not. So what might you recommend that they go down to the bookstore and pick up a copy of?
I'm gonna go. I'll throw one out. I'm gonna go old school. I'm gonna go Ida B. Wells Barnett. I'm gonna go Red Record.
Okay. You want to tell us why?
I'm gonna go. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think because Ida B. Wells gives us a historical kind of counterpoint, so that we see that this fight to spotlight violence, this fight for racial justice, and the use of technology, in her case, the photograph, the photo camera, it's a centuries long trek and a centuries long battle, and many of the issues that we've raised in this Q&A, many of the tensions, many of the struggles that we're battling with, the contradictions of inuring people, of normalization, of objectification, of violence, of spectacle. She deals with all of it, and she did a whole lot more with a whole lot less. So and she's a towering journalist who people should just know. She's a towering thinker, a towering organizer, who I think is underappreciated in the story of journalism. And in the same way that, like, as an anthropologist, I always say, you got to read Zora Neale Hurston, right? As a journalist and as a sociologist, you got to read Ida B. Wells.
Okay.
And she was towering at 4'10" or something like that.
Yes.
Too, right?
Yes.
Which is an achievement in itself. I'm going to go old school also, but a little less old school than Mark. I'm going to say anything by James Baldwin. But in particular, I'm going to say, read the short essays. The Price of the Ticket, which is a wonderful essays. And the reason is because Baldwin understood all this. I think he understood us now better than we do. And he's been gone from us for what, about 20 years now, Mark? I'm trying to remember when 1988.
More than that, almost 40.
Really?
Yeah, he died in the 80s. Yeah.
I think he died 88 or 89 or something like that. But anyway.
Yeah, so 35 years.
Wow, that is 35 years. Baldwin not only.
But Todd is a Mets fan, so he anything after the Mets won a World Series in '85, he doesn't really.
It was 86. It was 86,
right? He's stuck.
And Mark's a Phillies fan, so he's just feeling good that they made the World Series last year.
Exactly.
But we're both feeling good. The baseball season's starting very soon.
Yes.
I think not only does Baldwin speak to all these issues, including violence, including racism, American systemic racism, talking about American systemic racism long before the 1619 Project or critical race theory was being discussed in the popular culture. I can tell you that. But he also was a poet, and I mean that term broadly. He was a writer with extraordinary gifts in the English language. And there's that poetic sensibility is so rich in everything that he wrote, and it brings a certain kind of enlightenment, it seems to me, to these subjects that is worth everybody's time and effort.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for your time tonight. It's been wonderful talking to you and learning from your insights about American society and what's wrong with it, and maybe a little bit about how we can make some things better anyway. Let me
I
turn-
wish we could see all these 80 people that are out there. I mean,
No, I
feel like they're
know.
all hiding behind pillars somewhere. It's just so silly.
Maybe next time we can do that.
Yeah.
So let me turn the virtual mic back to Maggie.
Hi, well, thank you for another great conversation. This was really great. And on behalf of all of our sponsors and supporters who made this program possible, we extend our deepest thanks to Todd Brewster and Marc Lamont Hill and Dan Barrett for joining us this evening. And it's with gratitude that we thank the staff and volunteers of the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library for making this production possible. Again, this event will be posted next week on the library's YouTube channel, so please spread the word about it. And of course, thanks to our virtual audience who joined us here this evening. Thank you again very much.